horrified and ashamed of how our country behaved, about a policy that ripped kids from their homes, from their communities, from their culture and their language, and forced assimilation upon them. This is a piece of our past, of decades past, that resonates and echoes and is and continues to be a lived reality of consequences for many, many Canadians today. So, specifically to the members of the Cowessess community and Treaty 4 communities, we are sorry. It was something that we cannot undo in the past, but we can pledge ourselves every day to fix in the present and into the future. And that means recognizing the harms, the impacts, the intergenerational trauma, the cycles of challenges that far too many Indigenous peoples face in this country because of actions that the federal government and other partners deliberately and willingly undertook. I spoke with Chief Cadmus Delorme yesterday, the Chief of Cowessess First Nations, and offered all of the federal government's continued support and partnership, not just on supporting the communities that are grieving for the discovery of these graves, but also on the work that we must do to help them heal, to create opportunities to move forward, including on the issue of child and family services. We know that even long after residential schools closed in this country, child and family service, in the stated purpose of protecting children's well-beings, continued to take them away from their communities, continued to remove them from their language and culture, and place them in foster homes in non-Indigenous communities all across the country. That's why one of the calls of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to restore the care of kids at risk to the communities themselves. And in my conversation with Chief Cadmus, Chief Delorme, we talked directly about how we could even further accelerate the great work that Cowessess has already been doing on moving forward on child and family services as an example of the kind of work that is being done right across the country, and in recognition of the terrible time that the community is going through right now. This has come on the heels of the terrible news out of Kamloops, and it has caused a lot of Canadians to reflect on our past and how it has impacts on our present, to have difficult conversations with their loved ones, with their kids, about Canada's history and Canada's present. Truth and reconciliation requires that we start with truth. And we start by recognizing the terrible, terrible mistake that we willingly undertook in the past, taking kids from their homes and communities and leaving them open to incredible challenges and hardship as we tried to remove their languages and cultures from them. With Canada Day coming up next week, a lot of people, I think, will be reflecting on many different things. Reflecting on the really tough year we just had with COVID-19, how much we lost, how much we learned, how much we've been there for each other through difficult times. But at the same time, many, many Canadians will be reflecting on reconciliation, on our relationship with Indigenous peoples and how it has evolved and how it needs to continue to evolve rapidly. We have so many things we need to work on together. And I think this Canada Day, it will be a time of reflection on what we've achieved as a country, but on what more we have to do. So as we gather with family and friends, carefully still, and reflect on our past, we need to understand and remind ourselves that Canada didn't happen by accident, and it won't continue without effort. And this coming Canada Day, I think we all need to pledge ourselves to doing what we can to continue that effort to make Canada better, all the while respecting and listening to those for whom it's not yet a day of celebration. I think all of us need to aspire and work hard to get to the point where everyone across this country will be able to celebrate fully all that this great country is and all it will be able to continue to be into the coming years, and know that if we're going to be that, we all have more work to do, because that's the story of Canada, always stepping up with more work to do. Yesterday, I also talked with National Chief Bellegarde, because tragically, Cowessess is not the only place in this country where children died in the residential school system. It's not the only place where children faced abuse, loneliness, illness, and neglect. So to all families and survivors across the country, I know that no words can right these terrible wrongs. It is with our actions that we need to continue to recognize the truth and to do everything we can to support you. Following the discovery at the former Kamloops residential school earlier this month, we've made $27 million available immediately to Indigenous communities to find and honour children who died at these institutions. For communities in Saskatchewan in particular, like Cowessess, we've reached an agreement with the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations to provide almost $4.9 million to search for burial sites. And for people across the country, we're providing whatever mental health support survivors, families, and communities need for healing. Le système de pensionnat a été conçu pour effacer les langues et les cultures autochtones. Quand je discute avec des dirigeants et des membres des communautés, on parle souvent de l'importance de prendre des mesures concrètes pour réparer ces torts. C'est exactement la raison pour laquelle on a fait adopter la loi sur les langues autochtones, qui est une étape essentielle sur le chemin de la réconciliation, et on continue d'aller de l'avant. Lundi, j'ai eu une rencontre avec le commissaire et les directeurs du tout premier bureau du commissaire aux langues autochtones. Notre travail en partenariat se poursuit afin de permettre aux cultures et aux langues autochtones de s'épanouir et de se développer. Il en reste beaucoup à faire pour rectifier les erreurs du passé et éliminer les écarts qui existent encore aujourd'hui. En tant que gouvernement, on va toujours être là pour accomplir le travail nécessaire, mais nous nous devons tous de continuer à faire partie de ce progrès, de ces avancées sur le chemin de la réconciliation. La semaine prochaine, c'est la fête du Canada. Et ça nous donne l'occasion de réfléchir non seulement à l'année extrêmement difficile par laquelle on vient juste de passer, mais aussi à l'histoire du Canada et son impact sur le présent, particulièrement pour les communautés autochtones. Il y a des gens qui voudront pas et pourront pas célébrer la fête du Canada cette année, et nous devons les écouter, les respecter et s'engager à en faire encore plus, à réfléchir au pays que nous sommes et au pays qu'on veut être, et savoir que chacun d'entre nous a son rôle à jouer pour avancer, pour continuer de devenir et d'être le meilleur pays au monde. This morning, I also want to share an update about where we are in the fight against this pandemic. And to begin with, I have some good news about vaccine deliveries. We committed to reaching 9.1 million Pfizer doses delivered to Canada in July as part of our summer ramp-up. We've now received confirmation of our July vaccine delivery schedule from Pfizer, and it provides us the clear path to reach that goal. In other words, we're keeping our commitment. Of course, we've shared these delivery details with the provinces and territories so that they can get doses into arms as soon as they arrive. Canada is leading the world on vaccination. Over 76% of eligible Canadians have had at least a first dose, and over 26% have had a second. But let's keep that momentum up. Remember, you need a second dose to stay safe. It's not something you can do halfway. Just like by now everybody knows the mask goes over your nose and mouth, we all have to get that second shot once we've gotten our first. En ce qui concerne les vaccins, on va avoir reçu un total de plus de 68 millions de doses d'ici la fin juillet. Ça fait beaucoup de vaccins. C'est la voie à suivre pour vaincre cette pandémie au Canada. À ce sujet, plus tard aujourd'hui, la Dr Tam va présenter un modèle à jour des prédictions du nombre de cas pour les prochaines semaines. Au cours des 15 derniers mois, ces modèles n'ont pas toujours donné lieu à de bonnes nouvelles. Mais parce que les gens se font vacciner, parce que les gens sont restés à la maison et ont suivi les règles de santé publique, la situation actuelle est plutôt encourageante. Si on reste sur cette lancée, en faisant attention et en se faisant vacciner, le nombre de cas va continuer à diminuer. Ça veut dire qu'on va pouvoir continuer à aller de l'avant, prudemment, avec la réouverture. Alors, faites-vous vacciner quand ce sera votre tour. Ça va vous protéger et protéger votre famille, votre communauté, et ça va tous nous permettre de se rapprocher de la fin de cette crise. Now, before I end for today, I want to take a moment to talk to all the kids out there who are starting their summer break. It's been a tough year. I know that. I spent a lot of time watching my grade 1 Hadrian trying to stay focused on a computer with his Lego beside him as he's getting through grade 1. And nobody wants to have gone through an entire school year like this, but so many of you have. You've been incredibly strong. You've figured out how to help around the family, help around the house, help your mom and dad in difficult times, stay focused on school even though it was totally different. You've missed your friends, but you've found ways to play with them virtually. We've all made incredible sacrifices this year, but you have made an awful lot as kids. So I want to say thank you, that we're proud of you. Your parents are proud of you. Your teachers are proud of you, and Canada is proud of everything you did to help us get through this year and hopefully end this pandemic very soon. So you've earned a better summer. Yes, we'll still have to be careful, and it won't entirely be normal as a summer, but it'll be pretty great. We're all looking forward to getting back outside and having fun with our friends. And we're going to be able to do an awful lot of that this summer because you stayed focused on helping, on being there, and on getting us all through it. And to parents and teachers, thank you. I know it's really been tough as well. And I know if, again, you're like my household, you're busy thinking about how we're going to get our kids away from those screens that were so integral to their daily lives over the past many, many months, and actually have them play together and play outside and drop some of those electronic habits. But we have gotten through this. We're not quite done. We still need to be careful and vigilant, and will for quite a while. But things are so much better because Canadians pulled together. Thank you for everything you've done, for your kids, for your students, for our communities. Thank you for having their backs as we will continue to have yours. Notre gouvernement a investi des milliards de dollars pour apporter aux élèves, aux enseignants et au personnel l'aide dont ils avaient besoin. Par exemple, pour le conseil scolaire du district d'Algoma en Ontario, ce financement a permis de faire une série de mises à niveau pour améliorer la ventilation et l'éclairage. À la rentrée, les élèves vont donc pouvoir retrouver des classes plus sécuritaires et mieux adaptées à leurs besoins. L'année a été difficile pour tout le monde. Mais on va continuer d'investir pour être certain que les enfants, les parents, les travailleurs et tout le monde puissent revenir en force. Merci beaucoup. Je suis maintenant prêt à prendre vos questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier ministre. On va commencer avec les questions au téléphone aujourd'hui. Opérateur, c'est à vous.
you, merci. You may press star 1 if you have a question. Vous pouvez appuyer sur étoile 1 si vous avez une question. This question is from Christy Kirkup from the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead.
Hello, Prime Minister. Will you ensure there is an independent investigation into whether there were crimes and potential cover-ups of crimes at Indian residential schools?
I think people want to properly understand what happened. Canadians across the country are waking up to something that, quite frankly, Indigenous communities and people who've worked closely with the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have long known. That far too many kids, thousands upon thousands of kids across the country, were taken from their families, from their communities, from their homes, sent to far-off residential schools, and never came home, often without information, without any details being given back to their families on what happened to their loved ones, to their children. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has put forward significant calls to action that will allow for a proper understanding of what happened, of documenting, of giving families opportunities to grieve, to heal. And that is something that we are supporting full-heartedly and wholeheartedly as we move forward. We will continue to be there to support the communities in their needs as they grieve, as they work through this, as they get the understanding and knowledge they need in order to heal. We will keep putting Indigenous peoples and their wishes at the center of everything we do.
Following up, Christy.
Respectfully, Prime Minister, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was collecting stories from survivors. What they did not have was subpoena powers to subpoena documents from the government, from the churches. And Murray Sinclair, the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, says there now needs to be an independent investigation where individuals have subpoena powers in order to compel the release of documents and to conduct this formal investigation. So to ask again, is there openness on the part of the federal government to launching an independent investigation to determine once and for all if there were crimes committed at the school?
As I have said many times, Kirsty, there is an openness and there is a willingness and there is a desire and a drive in this government to do everything that is necessary to support Indigenous communities, to support all Canadians who want to know the truth, so that we can move forward on reconciliation. We have invested millions in supporting the specific calls to action on missing children linked to residential schools. We have invested billions in fulfilling all the calls to action and working to continue to fulfill them. We are there to be a partner in whatever is needed to find the full truth and ensure reconciliation is possible.
Thank you. Operator, next question on the phone.
La prochaine question est de Pierre Saint-Arnaud, de la presse canadienne. La parole est à vous.
Oui, bonjour, M. Trudeau. Je reviens sur la question précédente. On a affaire vraiment, si on regarde, là, à des actes criminels. Est-ce qu'on va aller du côté des poursuites criminelles? Est-ce qu'on va aller de l'avant, par exemple, avec des enquêtes policières sur qu'est-ce qui s'est passé dans les pensionnats autochtones?
On est ouvert à prendre toutes les mesures nécessaires pour en apprendre plus sur la vérité de ce qui se passait et d'assurer qu'il y ait des conséquences sur les systèmes, sur les organismes, sur les institutions et peut-être dans certains cas sur les individus. On reconnaît que ça fait des décennies, une centaine d'années depuis qu'on vit cette politique erronée du gouvernement. Et tout en cherchant la vérité et en trouvant la vérité, nos ressources doivent se concentrer bien sûr sur le présent, sur l'appui pour ceux qui ont besoin de guérison, qui ont besoin de ressources pour pouvoir passer à travers et et assurer des opportunités pour leur communauté, pour leurs enfants, pour leurs citoyens. Nos investissements sont ancrés dans aujourd'hui et demain, mais on le sait très bien, pour bâtir un meilleur aujourd'hui et demain, il faut comprendre tout à fait ce qui se passe dans le passé.
En suivi, la presse canadienne.
Oui, M. Trudeau, puisque vous en parlez, côté réparation, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire? Comment est-ce qu'on peut agir? Il y a des communautés autochtones qui n'ont toujours pas d'eau potable. Il y a beaucoup de manques, il y a beaucoup de difficultés dans les communautés autochtones. À quoi est-ce qu'on regarde actuellement du côté des réparations qui vont sûrement devoir être faites à ces communautés?
Je comprends que beaucoup de Canadiens sont choqués et horrifiés par ce qu'ils voient dans les nouvelles depuis quelques semaines. Et ils ont raison de l'être. C'est choquant et horrifiant ce qui s'est passé au peuple autochtone dans ce pays depuis des décennies, depuis des générations. Mais ce n'est pas des nouvelles pour beaucoup de gens autochtones dans ce pays. Ils savent depuis très longtemps qu'il y a des milliers d'enfants qui sont allés dans les écoles résidentielles qui ne sont jamais rentrés chez eux. Et en tant que gouvernement, ça fait 6 ans qu'on travaille avec eux justement sur la réconciliation, sur les investissements qui vont en finir avec les avis d'ébullition d'eau. On a levé plus de 108 différents avis d'eau potable à long terme à travers le pays. Il nous en reste encore à faire, mais on en a fait énormément. On a ouvert de nouvelles écoles, on a investi dans des programmes d'appui pour des enfants. On a créé des projets de loi sur la protection des langues autochtones, la protection de la culture autochtone, d'assurer que les jeunes à risque restent dans leur communauté et soient pris en charge par leur communauté, dans leur langue, dans leur culture, de la bonne façon. Je comprends l'impatience que tout le monde a qu'on en fasse encore plus et on est là pour en faire encore plus. Mais ça fait 6 ans qu'on travaille en partenariat avec les communautés autochtones. Ça n'a pas pris des nouvelles horrifiantes comme on a eu dans les dernières semaines pour se dire « Ah, on devrait faire quelque chose ». On y travaille. Mais évidemment, il reste encore beaucoup à faire et on va continuer d'être là pour les faire avec et en partenariat avec les peuples autochtones.
Merci. Opérateur, dernière question au téléphone.
The next question is from Raisa Patel from the Toronto Star. Please go ahead.
Good morning, Prime Minister. You said a few moments ago that you would be putting Indigenous people at the forefront of everything you do. Some Indigenous groups have strongly criticized Minister Bennett for the text message she sent to MP Wilson-Raybould yesterday. The Union BC of Indian Chiefs has called for her immediate resignation. Do you believe she still has a role in your cabinet after sending this message?
What Minister Bennett did was wrong. It was hurtful. And of course, I'm deeply disappointed. She did the right thing by apologizing because it was the wrong thing to do. As a government, as ministers, as Canadians, we need to be focused on the work that needs to happen for Indigenous people across this country who've been going through extremely difficult times, not just these past weeks, but over years and generations. We need to end drinking water advisories. We need to build more housing. We need to settle land claims and treaties in ways that demonstrate the partnerships for the future. We need to protect Indigenous kids, keep them in their culture and languages. We need to focus on economic opportunity for Indigenous peoples. And these are things that we've all been working on very, very hard. And those are the real important things that we need to do. So I am disappointed by what Minister Bennett did. She has apologized quite rightly. It was wrong and it was hurtful. And we all need to stay focused on the things that matter. And mistakes like this are hurtful and nudge us in the wrong direction instead of steadily moving in the right direction.
Given that Minister Bennett is tasked
Juste
with...
une seconde, je vais juste répondre en français. Ce que la ministre Bennett a fait a été une erreur, manquait de respect et a fait beaucoup de peine. Oui, je suis déçu par ce qu'elle a fait et c'est approprié et important qu'elle se soit excusée, sincèrement et profondément. Parce que les peuples autochtones dans ce pays passent des moments très difficiles. Et nous devons d'être concentrés, en tant que gouvernement, en tant qu'individus, sur les problèmes graves, importants et profonds auxquels ils font face, que ce soit les avis d'ébullition d'eau, que ce soit le manque de logement, que ce soit les investissements dans les enfants, que ce soit les investissements pour protéger les langues, la culture, pour s'assurer que les communautés soient en contrôle de leurs enfants en difficulté. C'est des priorités que nous avons et malheureusement, ce qu'on a vu a rendu ça un peu plus difficile.
Following up, Toronto Star.
Given that Minister Bennett is tasked with strengthening the relationship between the federal government and Indigenous peoples, what do you say to some members of the Indigenous community who may now be doubting the authenticity of your government's approach to advancing meaningful reconciliation?
I spoke with Carolyn Bennett this morning. I know how hard she has worked and continues to work on this important file. I know her heart. I know the efforts she has put in over years on this. And we both understand that there is now even more work for her to do. And I know we will do it together.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tom Perry, CBC. You were talking earlier about how far you're willing to go in terms of looking in, making sure there's accountability here. Some chiefs are describing these grave sites as crime scenes. And I'm wondering, if there's going to be accountability, how far are you willing to go? Do you need to see the police come in? Do we need to see international investigators come in? What is your government willing to do?
I think the first thing we need to do is be there for the communities and what they want and what they need and what answers they need to get. These are people who've lost their loved ones, people who continue to feel the hurt of grief, of loss from decades and indeed generations past. Loss that has continued to affect and impact on their daily lives, even if they happened, in many cases, so many years ago. So they will be put at the center of all of our steps. I've heard some people say, you should just go in with bulldozers and dig them up and find out exactly what happened. These are people's grandparents, great aunts, great uncles, loved ones. Respect for them, understanding their wishes, their desires. Yes, for answers, for closure, but also for dignity and respect for those loved ones they lost. So every step of the way, my pledge to all Canadians is that we will put Indigenous peoples and their wishes for their loved ones, for their communities, at the very core of whatever next steps we take. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission laid it out clearly. We need truth. We need to understand what happened. There needs to be accountability, absolutely. But that needs to be driven by and based on the choices and desires and needs of the people who are at the center of this, the people who are the victims of this shameful policy and who continue to live the echoes of it every single day. Je pense que le plus important, et je comprends l'outrage et la frustration de tous les Canadiens que ce soit passé chez nous et qui soient juste en train de découvrir ce que les peuples autochtones savent très bien depuis des années, des générations. qu'il y a beaucoup d'enfants qui sont allés aux écoles résidentielles, aux pensionnats autochtones et qui ne sont jamais revenus. Alors maintenant, pour découvrir la vérité, pour pouvoir avancer sur la réconciliation, nous devons de respecter leurs désirs, leurs besoins, pour guérir, pour continuer, pour avancer dans la bonne direction pour eux. J'ai entendu des gens dire rentrer avec des machines puis excaver tous ces enfants et on va savoir exactement ce qui se passe. Ben voyons. C'est les membres des familles, des communautés autochtones. Ça prend un niveau de respect. Oui, peut-être on va arriver à un moment comme cela, mais ce serait parce que les familles et la communauté décident que c'est ce dont ils ont besoin. À chaque étape, nous allons travailler avec eux, nous allons être là pour eux et nous allons suivre ce dont ils ont besoin dans les prochaines étapes.
Hello, Prime Minister. It's Annie Bergeron-Oliver with CTV National News. You, along with many Indigenous leaders, have called on the Pope to apologize, but that still has not happened. What can your government do to hold the Catholic Church accountable for its roles in residential schools? And could that next step include something like removing the Catholic Church's charitable tax status, even temporarily?
I don't think we're going to get to anywhere near that level of conflict. I have heard directly from many Catholics across this country who want to see the Church play a positive role in this. I have spoken personally, directly, with His Holiness Pope Francis to impress upon him how important it is, not just that he makes an apology, but that he makes an apology to Indigenous Canadians on Canadian soil. I know that the Catholic Church leadership is looking and very actively engaged in what next steps can be taken. And we will continue to be there to work with them, to facilitate things, and to encourage them to keep doing right by Canadians and Indigenous peoples who are very preoccupied by this piece of history. Okay. Je pense que c'est extrêmement important que toutes les institutions et organismes qui avaient un rôle à jouer dans cette partie de l'histoire soient là pour aider à la guérison, aider à passer au-delà de cette réalité. Et donc, je sais que des catholiques à travers le pays, y compris les évêques, les archevêques, sont en train de regarder exactement comment ils peuvent faire pour assurer la vérité et la réconciliation. Quand je suis allé voir le pape il y a quelques années, je lui ai expliqué à quel point c'est important d'avoir des excuses directement au peuple autochtone du pays sur le territoire canadien. Et je sais qu'il y a bien des gens à l'intérieur de l'Église qui sont en train de travailler sur cela. Et en tant que gouvernement, nous allons être là pour faciliter ça.
Bonjour, M. Trudeau. Christian Noël de Radio-Canada. Pensez-vous que ce serait approprié de la part du gouvernement d'utiliser les tribunaux pour forcer l'Église catholique à dévoiler leurs documents sur cette époque? Et vous, personnellement, pensez-vous que des choses criminelles se sont passées dans les pensionnats autochtones?
D'abord, j'espère et je pense qu'on n'arrivera pas au point où on va devoir utiliser les tribunaux pour forcer ces records à être partagés. Je sais qu'il y a eu déjà un grand partage de records, mais s'il en reste d'autres à faire, je suis pas mal confiant que les institutions et les églises impliquées vont vouloir partager tout ça. Par rapport aux actes criminels, c'est certain qu'il y a une grande chance que oui, parce qu'on sait qu'il y avait de l'abus. On sait qu'il y avait de la maltraitance dans beaucoup de ces institutions. Mais on sait aussi qu'il y a eu des maladies. On sait aussi qu'il y a eu des enfants qui ont péri de causes, je je dirais, plus naturel dans une situation profondément non naturelle. Les avoir arrachés de leur communauté, de leur famille. La Comité de la vérité, la réconciliation en a parlé directement que ces enfants vivaient dans des situations horribles et affreuses et beaucoup de survivants ont raconté des histoires de décès tragiques. Certains n'étaient pas criminels, mais d'autres sûrement l'étaient. Quand on parle d'abus, quand on parle de négligence, certainement que dans les histoires, on a vu des actes criminels. Donc, ça fait partie de la réflexion que nous devons avoir. Je recommande à tous les Canadiens de se pencher, de voir ce qu'ils peuvent de la Commission de vérité et réconciliation qui raconte des histoires de ces enfants, de leurs collègues qui ont survécu, des enfants qu'on a perdus dans ces pensionnats autochtones. Ces histoires ont été partagées, mais comme on a vu de la surprise des Canadiens depuis quelques semaines, avec Kamloops et maintenant avec Kawassas, qu'il y a beaucoup de Canadiens qui ne comprennent pas à quel point ça fait partie de notre histoire, une partie honteuse de notre histoire, et on se devrait de tous en apprendre un petit peu sur la misère et les défis que ces enfants ont vécus, d'entendre leur histoire et de réfléchir à comment, aujourd'hui, parce qu'on ne peut pas changer le passé, mais on peut certainement transformer le présent et l'avenir pour être mieux. I think as people read the stories, and I encourage Canadians to reach out to look through the resources of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that share heartbreaking personal stories of loss, of neglect, of misery that so many Indigenous people went through in residential schools. There are stories of abuse, of neglect, that, yes, obviously have crimes that would be severely punished today. But there are also stories that are just heartbreaking in their sadness, of illness, of disease, of things that you can't directly blame on any one person or institution, but indeed on a system that ripped kids from their homes, from their language, from their culture, from their communities, to erase that culture, to erase that identity. That was the policy of Canada hundreds of years, many, many decades ago. And it was a policy that isn't just part of our past, that continues to have echoes today in challenges facing Indigenous people now, with higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of addiction and suicide, that have consequences every time. Still, Child and Family Services takes a kid at risk and removes them from their community, removes them from their language and culture for their protection. Well, that's not right, and that continues to this day, which is why we worked with Indigenous communities over the past few years to develop Child and Family Services legislation that would keep kids at risk in their communities and give the communities the resources to care for their own kids in their language, in their culture. These are the things that we are working on doing. But there is so much more to do. So even as Canadians are shocked and appalled at our past, so too should they be shocked and appalled at the consequences of that past that exists for far too many still today.
Minister Michael Couture with Global National. I wanted to know, how can you ask First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities to continue to work with a Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations who should have known better than to perpetuate a racist stereotype about Indigenous people? I mean, when is an apology just simply not enough here?
What Minister Bennett did was wrong, and it was hurtful. There's no question about it. And whatever reasons of interpersonal issues, there's no excuse. And that's why it was right that she apologized. But I know Carolyn's heart. I know how hard she has worked for decades on this issue, and I know how much more there is for us all to do. And I know that she understands how much more work she's going to have to do in the coming days, weeks, and months.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Teresa Wright from the Canadian Press. Canadians, First Nations, Indigenous peoples across the country they want to know the extent of this national tragedy. Isn't it time for you to commit more than $27 million, which, just to put it in perspective, is 0.00567% of this year's total $457.6 billion budget? Or to put it another way, it's half of 1% of 1%. Don't you think that more money should be dedicated toward finding these children and giving their families some peace?
In speaking with Indigenous Canadians, I think it's important for non-Indigenous Canadians to know that as much as there is very real grief at the news of the discovery of these hundreds of unmarked graves, that there is trauma and triggering and anguish in families who are hearing this news, it is not exactly news for Indigenous peoples that thousands of kids went away to residential schools and never came home. That has been known for a long time by Indigenous Canadians. And that intergenerational trauma and loss is part of the story that explains why Indigenous peoples are facing so many struggles today. Challenges around culture and language and identity, challenges around homelessness and incarceration and lack of economic opportunity. Because the trauma of the past echoes very much today. So I understand Canadians are all surprised and shocked at this news, and we should be. It is horrifying news. But it is not exactly news. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission reported on this years and years and years ago, and as a government we have been working with Indigenous communities to ensure that we can move forward on finding these graves and establishing records and helping Canadians grieve and Indigenous people grieve. And as I've said, we will continue to give all the resources necessary to track down their loved ones, to give closure, to do what is necessary for those communities. But that is only a small part of what we need to do to make sure that every kid grows up in a safe and supportive household, in his language, in her culture, that kids get to go to good schools, that elders get to retire in dignity and safety in their Indigenous communities, that elders get to pass on traditional knowledge to their grandchildren, that economic opportunity for businesses, for professional development be there for Indigenous peoples, that we settle claims and treaties that have lingered for decades, that we establish self-government for Indigenous peoples, that we protect Indigenous languages in a real and tangible way. These are things that we need to be investing and have been investing billions upon billions of dollars in the past years and will continue to into the future. So yes, Indigenous communities across this country have my commitment that they will get the resources necessary to recover and document as much as possible these kids in these graves. But they also have my commitment to be there on the healing and the fixing of the generations of trauma that Canadians have all too often turned an eye from, all too often shrugged away from. Reconciliation is not something that is important that we work on the side as we continue to build Canada. It is something that goes to the heart of who we are. And if it took discovering these graves for Canadians to wake up to how much we need to continue to do, then that perhaps gives us a starting point to continue to do even more.
Just following up on some of your earlier comments, you said that when it comes to trying to discover the scope of this tragedy, this national tragedy, you want First Nations to be the ones leading the way. However, I don't think anybody that I've heard of has talked about bringing bulldozers in. And in fact, the FSIN Chief Cameron is calling for a full, independent, and public review of deaths of First Nations children. So is there not something that you could do to take the onus off these communities so that you can help these communities to a national strategy to help with the search and identification of these children?
Yes, we have launched all of our efforts from the federal side to be there to support in the search, in the identification, in the next steps necessary. My commitment to Chief Delorme, to Chief Cameron, to Perry Bellegarde, and to leaders of the Indigenous communities across this country is that we will be there with them every step of the way as needed, and not needed by us, needed by them, to get the closure, the healing necessary to be able to continue to work together on the range of challenges faced by Indigenous peoples.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier ministre. C'est ce qui met fin à la conférence de presse d'aujourd'hui. This is what ends today's presser.
Merci tout le monde.